Manhole II, the Cricket Man. 3.5 hours north of Chicago, there's a summer camp for boys in Waupaca, Wisconsin, called Camp Shin-Go-Beek. It's a large campground with a pine forest next to Gooseneck Lake. There, hundreds of scouts take various classes during their 4-week stay. Some of the popular classes are canoeing, archery, and 20-gauge shotgun. It was the summer of '87, and Troop 16 rented a public school bus to pile full of teenage souls. In the last row of the bus sat Jason and Michael. These two older scouts were swinging tube socks loaded with pocket change over the side of the seat in front of them, where the young Leroy sat alone. Leroy stared at the back of the seat in front of him. A couple days later, the scouts had settled into their tent ground. Leroy felt something hit his back while he was picking up kindling in the woods. He turned around and saw no one but a flick knife on the ground behind him. Next week, Leroy kept same thing. I am going to kill you. One morning during the third week of camp, Leroy was walking on the trail to the mess hall for breakfast. As he turned a corner, he found Jason and Michael sitting on a fallen pine trunk. They grabbed him, hit him in the face, and took him back to the empty tent grounds. They pushed him into the outhouse and plunged his head into the outhouse toilet hole while they kicked his ribs. When they left him, he went down to Gooseneck Lake to clean himself off. He stayed under the water a long time. Later that afternoon, Leroy saw his friends again during shotgun. Shotgun was a large class held at the shooting range. A 3-mile hike back to the tent grounds, down an overgrown trail that carved through the pines. After class, Jason and Michael grabbed Leroy again and took him off the trail, deep into the trees. To a huge pine and pushed him against the trunk. Jason held Leroy to the trunk while Michael coiled twine around and around. Michael pulled it taut and looked at Leroy square in the eyes. Jason and Michael took turns spitting on Leroy's face until their mouths were dry. They left him there for the night, but they came back the next evening and spat on his face again and left him tied to the pine again. During the night, the twine gave way, and Leroy stumbled out into the dark. Disoriented, he wandered for hours. Eventually he came upon a large building. It seemed to be abandoned, because there were boards across the door and the windows were all broken. He crawled inside a windowsill on the first floor and smiled as he cut his fingers on a piece of glass about the frame. Inside were the ruins of a large sawmill that looked as if it had been dormant for several generations. With the moonlight, he made out that there was a catwalk to an office with a cot of some sort. He climbed up the stairs to the catwalk and made it halfway across the catwalk before it collapsed and he fell down into the mill's primary circular saw. He came to. He noticed that his lungs weren't working normally. Every time he inhaled, most of the air escaped through a couple of small holes made in his one pipe by the serrated edges of the circular saw. He could still force air into his lungs, but had to do it so quickly, constantly heaving in and out like a panting dog. This heaving created a particular sound as air passed through the new throat openings and the scar tissue that surrounded it. It reminded him of the sound of crickets rubbing their wings together. The cricket man looked to his left and noticed that his hand had also been injured during the fall. About a third of his wrist still kept his fingers and palm attached to his arm. He got up and after a lot of rummaging through the heaps of old tools and garbage, found a sharp piece of scrap metal about 2 foot long and bent to one side like a crooked Cutco knife. He smiled and finished sawing off the hand. Then smiling so hard his teeth ground together, he pushed one end of the metal stump and forced it down several inches within his forearm where it stayed. About 4 years later, Michael was hiking the trail back to the tent grounds from the shooting range. He had stayed at the range too long because the instructor had let him use the 12 gauge for the first time. He walked slowly because his shoulder and back hurt so much from the recoil. And darkness fell before he was halfway to camp. In the dark, he lost the worn trail and found himself in front of a sign that read, Happy Valley, the name of the Indian burial ground that had existed centuries before Camp Shin-Go-Beek. After looking around, lost and sore, Michael heard a strange sound behind him and hobbled into the valley, which sloped down and was filled with thick, milky mist. After a few minutes, he stopped and saw the unmistakable glint of metal in the swirling clouds of mist to his left. He tried to run, tripped over one of the small mounds of earth that littered the area. These mounds once served as graves for the members of the Menominee tribe. As he lay on the dirt, the cricket man leapt at him, turned him on his back, and opened his mouth. He stabbed Michael in the mouth with his arm, took out the blade, and looked at the blood dripping from the metal for a few moments. Again, the blade was thrust into Michael's mouth until his gag reflex made him twitch and spasm. The cricket man repeated this 4 or 5 times, always looking at the blade for a short time to watch the blood drip before ramming back into Michael again. Later that night, Jason was lying in his tent trying to sleep, listening to the sound of the crickets as he often did. All of a sudden he realized that amongst the crickets was another sound that was similar and at first masked by the crickets, but now definitely distinguishable. For several minutes he lay listening to it move around his tent. Jason thought it must be a large animal and poked his head out of the tent flap with his flick knife in hand. As soon as his head was exposed, a rock hit him over the head and he passed out. When he woke up, he was in the abandoned sawmill, tied to a piece of lumber. From what he could see, the cricket man was next to him with a small bucket of water. The cricket man put his hand in the bucket and pushing it on his face and stabbing in the stomach. Eventually, the bucket was empty. Since then, every now and again, the scouts of Troop 16 have found the remains of campfires in the wild areas of the forest, or report food stolen from the mess hall storage, but the Cricket Man has not been found. Several of the older campers have also mentioned strange occurrences where their gear had been taken out to the woods and strewn about all over. Although their bodies were never recovered, graves were marked out for Michael and Jason in the camp chapel, just off the overgrown trail that runs out to the shooting range.